This is my 153rd video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is another kit build, finishing with some running, this time of Ratios Kit 571 for an LMS, ex-Caledonian, Bogie or Wagon. This kit is now sold by Pico under the Parkside brand as PC 571, but I was building it from an old Ratio version as seen here. I bought this from British Model Trains in Cambridge, Ontario, Canada, just up the road from me, hence the price in dollars. Quite a small box for a kit that builds to a rather large wagon. Here's what was in the box. One single-sided instruction sheet, 2 sprues of light grey parts for the wagon body, 1 sprue of dark grey parts for the 2 bogies, and a black sprue with 4 plastic axles with wheels. Here's a closer view of the plastic parts. There was some flash that needed cleaning up, especially on the finer areas of the body parts and on the wheels. Here's a clearer view of the instructions. These were fairly clear and made sense on the whole. I did struggle a bit to sort out exactly how the bogie parts were supposed to go together. It's all very well and good writing top on the diagram, but since the actual parts aren't labelled, how am I supposed to know which side is the top? I did my best to remove as much of the flash as I could before taking the parts off the sprues. It was quite tricky removing the flash, especially around the fine areas. The wagon floor comes in 2 parts, half on each sprue. I guess this was done so that the whole of the wagon body could be made up of 2 identical sprues. So those 2 halves of the floor need to be butted up against each other, with the spaces for the fitting of the bogie bolsters at either end. The edges of the floors fit into grooves in the wagon sides, so the fit is quite positive. You just need to be sure that you get the ends aligned right and the 2 parts of the floor neatly joined in the middle. Once the 2 halves of the floor have been glued into the groove on one side and glued together in the middle, the other side is glued on again with the edge of the floor fitting into the groove in the side. These are the parts for the ends of the wagon and the buffers. The buffers weren't very well cast. I did sand them some more afterwards. The instructions suggested fitting the buffers to the ends before fitting the ends to the wagon. I fitted the buffers with their casting marks on the bottom rather than trying to remove those rather prominent casting marks on the buffer stems. Then I fitted the ends to the wagon, trying to get the miters at the corners as neatly joined as possible. I consulted the diagram in the instructions again to try to figure out where the small parts, such as the brake levers and cylinders, were supposed to go. Here are the parts for the brake, cylinders and reservoir. The reservoir came in 2 halves that needed to be glued together. Then I glued those parts to the bottom of the wagon. They fitted over the beams on the bottom, but there were no special marks indicating exactly where they should go, so I did my best to put them where indicated by the diagram. These are the little parts for the brake levers, which needed some tricky cleaning up from flash. There are only 2 brake lever parts, but there are fittings for them at both ends of each side, making 4 fittings in all. Following the diagram, I fitted both levers at the same end. You can see here that the levers are fitted at the near end, but there are also little fitting nubs for the levers at the far end. I removed those as this seemed reasonable, although the instructions didn't say anything about this. Here you can see one end of the wagon body and the parts for the 2 vacuum pipes. There's no exact indication as to where these should be fitted. This seemed about reasonable and roughly what the diagram suggested. Here is the sprue for the bogie parts, also including Ratio's own style of tension lock couplings. And here is the sprue for the wheels. As you can see, this was quite messy and quite a bit of cleaning up was required to get wheels that could actually be fitted and turn properly. Here are the axles and wheels removed from the sprue after some initial cleaning up, but it turned out that more was required. Here are the parts for the bogie sides and the stretchers, as the instructions call them, that will join the two sides. The stretchers are blank on one side and have ratio made in England printed on the other, but I wasn't sure which side was supposed to be the top. I thought it would be more reasonable to have the ratio printing on the bottom so that it could be seen after the wagon was assembled, but the parts seemed to fit better the other way up, with the ratio printing on the top. For the bogie sides, the hole in the centre must come above the stretcher, as that will be used to mount the pivoting piece and the pin that will join the bogie to the bolster on the wagon floor. These are the parts for the couplings, again cleaned up. The coupling hooks are rather long. I fiddled around a bit trying to figure out which way up the coupling parts went. It is possible to tell from the diagram if you look closely. The flanges on the ends of the loops point down, and the hooks also need to point down, so I've got the hooks in upside down in this picture. Here are those couplings after I got the hooks in the right way up and then glued the couplings to the pivoting bars, to which they locate with two small pins that fit into holes in the bars. The pins at top right will go through the holes in the pivoting bars and then be inserted into the bolsters, seen at bottom right, which will be glued to the wagon floor. The assembly is done by first passing the pin the right way through the pivoting bar, and then fitting the pins on the end of the bar into the holes in the bogie sides. It would probably have made sense to do this at the same time as the sides were glued to the stretcher, or at least the second side was glued to the stretcher, but this process was given as a subsequent step in the instructions, and it didn't matter all that much, as the glue holding the sides to the stretchers hadn't really completely set. Here are the bogies with the pivoting bars and their associated couplings now fitted between the bogie sides. Next, the wheels needed to be fitted between the bogie sides. I found that I needed to clean the wheels up more, as there's very little clearance, so the wheels won't turn if they have any extra plastic on them. The flanges of the wheels need to fit into the grooves in the stretcher, and must clear those grooves in order to be able to turn. The grooves were hardly open at all as the stretcher parts came, so I needed to open out those grooves with a knife in order to produce an assembly where the wheels could actually turn. Here are the two bogies now fully assembled and able to roll. And you can see the pins sticking up from them that will be inserted into the bolsters to pivot them. I glued the bogie bolsters in place on the floor of the wagon. At this point the assembly was basically completed, other than fixing the bogies to the wagon, and I needed to decide how I was going to finish the model. I found this picture on Pico's site. Presumably this can be taken as a reasonable example of how to finish this kit. I can't imagine how they got those little plates in the bottom centre, unless the latest Parkside version comes with decals for those. My ratio kit didn't come with any decals. I compared the colour of the wagon body with a couple of ready-made LMS wagons from different makers. It seemed that the grey shade of the ratio plastic was too light to be used as it was. So I spray-painted the wagon body with a light grey. It's probably still a bit light, but it's hard to get an exact match. I tried to paint appropriate areas black. I'm afraid I didn't do a very good job. I found it hard to paint the small parts at the base of the wagon sides without getting paint where I didn't want it. I painted the sides of the bogies black, but I didn't paint the couplings. As I say, unfortunately I got some smudges of black where I didn't want it. I did try to paint those little plates in the centre of the wagon side black. I put a coat of Future over the wagon body, as I didn't think that the decals would take at all well on the matte grey paint. Future does tend to run, hence the fact that the body is sitting on a paper towel to dry to absorb any extra Future. Once the Future dried, I was ready to decall the wagon. There were holes in the ends of the wagon body for coupling hooks, but no parts for these were supplied with the kit. I'd noticed this when I first unpacked the kit, so I picked up a pack of these Acura scale couplers when I was up to British Model Trains getting some other stuff. Here are two of the Acura scale couplers removed from the pack, quite nicely made items. I fitted the Acura scale couplers into the holes on the wagon ends using CA glue. Here's one of those in place. I've got some mess on the base a bit there from the future. I tried to get the end loops of the couplers to hook back onto the hooks to hold them up so that they wouldn't foul the tension lock couplings. I used Model Master waterslide decals to put running numbers and part of the load markings onto the wagon, using microset to help. I wasn't quite sure what the load markings were supposed to be, either 50 tons or 60 tons. I couldn't really make it out in any of the pictures. But I didn't have decals for either of those, so I used some decals for 10 tons and cut off the ones. Then I used an HMRS press fix digit to make up the 50 marking. Here's one of those markings after the press fix mounting paper has been removed. Fortunately, the press fix digit pretty much matched the Model Master decal. Then I used press fix decals for the large LMS letters. I sprayed a matte acrylic overcoat over the decals to protect them after they dried. I stuck 3/4 ounce self-adhesive weights to the floor of the wagon, one over each bogie and one in the middle. I loaded the wagon with some coarse ballast, as this was the best thing I could think of to simulate ore. I sprayed the load with isopropyl alcohol to wet it, and then applied watered-down white glue with a pipette. I put a bit of a wash over the wagon with black acrylic paint, thoroughly diluted in IPA. The wagon body certainly ended up a bit of a mess, not sure how much this is reasonable. Here's the other side. Some of the white glue ended up running down the sides and making marks, and I couldn't really remove those. I mixed up some paint to approximate what I thought the colour of ore might be. And I painted the load and the inside walls of the wagon. The paint didn't take all that well, so the result came out more pink than I intended. Finally, I fitted the bogies to the wagon by gluing the pins into the bogie bolsters. This needs to be done carefully, as you don't want to let any glue get between the bolster and the bogie, as that would prevent the bogie from turning. Here's the other side with the worse markings from the white glue. Those seem to have actually got more prominent as they dried. I tried the wagon with a loco on my little test track. It rolled okay, although it isn't a very free runner, as the plastic axles fitted into plastic holes generate some friction, and the extra weight that I added to the wagon increases that friction. Messy though it was, I felt that I could basically live with how this model came out. The ratio coupling hooks were very long, so when the wagon was coupled to the backman loco, only the backman hook was actually holding things together, as the ratio hook protruded too far to engage. I coupled the newly built wagon up on my Hornby layout. I used the Bachmann Midland 1F with the open cab, as this is a very nice little model and I wanted to give it some more running. Behind, I coupled an LMS brake van recently built from a Parkside kit, and now improved by gauging its wheels properly so it doesn't wobble anymore, hopefully. Here's the ore wagon coupled into that little train. The 1F with the open cab was professionally weathered by the model centre, and I added a few more details myself. The open cab means that you can really see the footplate crew and the controls well. So now let's finish with a little running video of the completed wagon. Alright, let's see if we can see a little bit of running with this wagon, this bogie wagon, built from the ratio kit. Unfortunately, it's only got plastic wheels with plastic axles running in plastic holes, so that doesn't make for the freest running, and I've added quite a bit of weight to it, which is going to add to that drag. So there's going to be a fair bit of drag from that wagon. Not much drag from the brake van behind it. That's built from the Parkside kit, and that has metal wheels with metal axles and proper brass bearings, and it doesn't weigh so much, so it won't have much drag. And I hope now I've got the wheels gauged properly so it won't wobble. And on the front, pulling the train, I've got the Bachmann model of the Midland 1F with the open cab, which is such a nice little model. That's basically why I use that again, because you can see the crew there, famous. I'm trying to make it focus on them for you. You can see the crew and the controls and everything. It's a nice little loco. Okay, so let me see if I can get this train going for you. And we'll see how it runs. It's at about 45% power. Maybe give it 50. Just needs a little bit more power to pull the thing, because as I say, there is a bit of drag from that Bogie wagon. At least I don't see anybody rocking. Everybody seems to me to be running along the track pretty solidly, which is always a good sign. It hopefully means the wheels are gauged right and they're turning right. It's a bit of a mess, that wagon. And some of the mess, I have to admit, was accidental rather than deliberate weathering, but I don't know. You tell me what you think in the comments. Does it look reasonable as a wagon? The ore's probably a bit excessively pink as well. Frankly, I really intended it to be a bit redder, but you know, the colour didn't take all that well on that. That's actually ballast I put in the Woodland Scenics ballast that I put in it, and then I painted it with a sort of reddish brown colour to serve as ore, but it came out pinker than I intended. But then I don't know, I guess the colour of ore varies a fair bit, so I would say that's running pretty decently. I mean, in terms of how it's running, I don't see any saying that it's rocking. And these Bachmann 1Fs, although they're only little 060 tank engines, run perfectly nicely across the points with no hesitating. So there you go. Well, that's all the point there, to demonstrate that, so I can stop him now, I guess. Well, there we go. So there we go. That's the Ratio ex-Caledonian LMS Bogie ore wagon running.